Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, to all of you who are returning or joining us for the first time for the Edward M. Kennedy Enduring Legacy series here at the EMK Institute. We are focused today on how Ted Kennedy worked not only across the aisle, but across the branches of government to shape and change the federal judiciary. My name is Bob Shrum. I'm currently the Warsaw Professor of Politics at the University of Southern California and the Director of the Center for the Political Future there. So much of what I have done in my life, I owe to Ted Kennedy, for whom I first worked as a speechwriter and as press secretary, and then as a consultant for 3 decades. Today, I am privileged to serve on the board of the EMK Institute. I am here to welcome you on behalf of the Institute and the board, and even more on behalf of all my colleagues who enlisted with Senator Kennedy in the causes so central to his 47 years of service in the United States Senate. We have an extraordinary panel, which will be led by our moderator, Kim Atkin Stohr, senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe. Let me turn this over to her now. Kim.
Thank you so much, Bob. And we do have a wonderful panel to discuss how Senator Kennedy used his influence, the balance of powers, and his relationships to influence the other 2 branches of government. A quick note for our audience, you can submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we will save time about the last 15 minutes of our program to answer as many of your questions as we can. But first, it is my pleasure to introduce this esteemed panel. I'm going to go in alphabetical order because as someone whose last name starts with an A, I prefer that. Jeff Blattner is currently the board chair of HIAS, a Jewish humanitarian organization that works in the United States and 16 other countries, providing vital services to refugees and asylum seekers of all faiths. He also serves as a special assistant attorney general with the Colorado Department of Justice and an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado Law School and a senior fellow at the Silicon Flatirons Institute Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship at the University of Colorado. From 1987 to 1995, Jeff was on the Senate Judiciary Committee staff of Senator Kennedy, serving as the senator's chief counsel from 1992 to 1995. He worked on 6 Supreme Court nominations and was the staff lead on 2 major civil rights laws, the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 and the Civil Rights Act of 1991. United States District Court Judge Patti Saris served as the chief judge of the United States District Court for the District of Massachusetts from 2013 to 2019. She was chair of the United States Sentencing Commission in Washington, D.C. from 2011 to 2017. And when Senator Kennedy was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, she worked as staff counsel. She later became assistant U.S. attorney and eventually chief of the civil division. And she served as a U.S. magistrate judge and as an associate justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court. She was appointed to the federal bench in 1994. And Margaret Spellings serves as the president and CEO of Texas 2036, a nonprofit organization building long-term data-driven strategies to secure Texas's continued prosperity. From 2005 to 2009, she was the U.S. Secretary of Education, leading the implementation of No Child Left Behind, the act that provided greater accountability for education of 50 million U.S. public school students. And she also served as president of the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas, Texas. Before joining Texas 2036, she also served as president of the 17-institution University of North Carolina system, an esteemed panel indeed. So I want to start off by asking all of you, and I will start off with Secretary Spellings for this. We talk about Senator Kennedy's influence across the many branches of government because of his mastery of being an effective senator, but also because of his commitment to public service. I'm going to go to all of you on this to reflect on this, but I'm going to start with you, Secretary Spellings. What was that commitment to public service and why did that make such a difference?
Well, he certainly embodied that himself. He always put himself in the game. He was a problem solver, solution oriented, knew his bottom lines, and also was a great, in his own very unique way, evangelizer and aggregator of people around a common problem or issue. And I just read this week, one of his senior people that I worked with during my Washington days has now just been named Vice President Harris's chief of staff. I mean, just the gift that he gave the American people in terms of, nurturing a generation of people who value public service, who watched him serve over many decades, I think is a terrific and probably under-heralded part of his legacy, because none of us would be on this panel unless he was part of that journey for us.
And I want to encourage all of our panelists to feel free to engage in one another. Just don't talk over one another. We know by now that Zoom, that doesn't work very well, but feel free to engage with one another too as I ask you questions. But I want to go to Judge Saris now on that same question about public service.
Yes, well, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here to honor a man that I worked for and deeply respected. I was a Boston girl, and I came down to Washington, D.C. with almost no experience in Washington in 1978, which with thinking I would be doing civil rights. So I'd be doing the great issues of the day, women's rights. So and then it turns out I was assigned to government regulation. And I remember thinking of that with such a sinking heart. And yet it's a classic example of the way the senator grappled with some of the big issues of the time. Justice Stephen Breyer, who was at the time a professor at Harvard Law School, got him engaged in issues of airline deregulation and the anti-competitive nature of both the trucking and the airline industries in ways that fundamentally changed both of them. He cared deeply about eliminating undue burdens of regulation, but very firm about the need for health safety regulations and not in any way impairing those. But it wasn't just there that he was intrigued with how to make government work better. People don't know this, but he actually was chair of the Judiciary Committee when the patent system was fundamentally reformed, and he cared about innovation. And finally, in my area, and we can talk about this more later on, in sentencing reform and trying to deal with unwarranted disparities in the sentencing system and trying to improve. Really, it turned out to be quite contentious. I think even he didn't know how contentious it was all going to turn into. But at the moment, at the time he tried to get sentencing reform, he got it passed 100-0 in the Senate. Nothing passes 100-0 anymore, and yet he was able to work across party lines to try and make the sentencing system work better through an expert commission, which I later chaired, and we can talk about that later. But he cared deeply about making the executive branch and the judiciary better operating entities.
Jeff Blattner.
Thank you, and it's a great honor to be with Secretary Spellings and Judge Saris and you. My experience with Senator Kennedy, like my colleagues on this panel, was just an absolute delight, an absolute honor. I think one thing that's really not perhaps appreciated as much about him was his love for the Constitution itself and for American history and for the legacy and traditions that he felt he was carrying on. I can remember one story, one of my responsibilities was to staff him on constitutional law issues. And we were talking one day and he started quoting to me something that occurred at the Constitutional Convention. And I looked at him and I said, that was not in the briefing materials. Where did that come from? Well, it turned out that when he was very seriously injured in a plane crash in the 1960s. And while he was recuperating and he was strapped to a bed for a long period of time, he read the entire notes on the Constitutional Convention. And that appreciation for history, for the law, the role of the law in making the government work, and most importantly to him, in achieving justice for all Americans, was just deeply embedded in his values and in his work. And you see it in his impact on the judiciary, one of the important legacies of which is one of our participants today, Judge Saris. But you see it also in the way that he worked with his colleagues to reform the law.
Can I jump in for one sec?
Yes,
I want to talk
please
about
jump in.
the bag. So at least when I was there, you had to get everything you wanted to tell the senator into the bag by the end of the day when he left. And he had this huge bag of reading materials, just what Jeff was talking about. So, at the end of the day, you try and get it in there. And, at 5 o'clock, he would go off to 3 fundraisers and 4 speeches or whatever. He was busy all night. And then you'd go out and brief him in the morning, sometimes at his house, sometimes in the office, and he will have read everything. So I'd like to add that to the prodigious nature of his work ethic, and trying to understand not just the daily efforts of every legislative aid, but also things like the constitutional ramifications.
Yeah.
Kimberly, since Patti threw down on the 100 to 0, I'm looking at, and it's one of my treasured possessions in my office, the vote count on the passage of No Child Left Behind, which he obviously was the lead Democrat on, which was 87 to 10 for a major law that affected every school child and community in this country. And also uniquely, we did that legislation and lots of other things like mental health parity, also very much involved with him with that issue, in regular order. So it was like the good old fashioned way of legislating back in the day, which I know was true when Jeff and Patti worked for him as well.
Yeah, and things have certainly changed here in Washington. And one big way that it's changed is with the Senate Judiciary Committee, which the senator headed. And Jeff, I want to turn to you on that. The senator understood the importance of the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, not just because the Senate Judiciary is powerful, as is the court, but for the things that he wanted to do, like protecting voting rights and civil rights. Talk a little bit about how the senator used that role to shape rights during that time and how it was so different than it is today.
Well, there are so many ways one could answer that. One of the most important and really overlooked roles of the Congress these days is to engage in dialogue with the courts about the interpretation of statutes. It's a little different dialogue with regard to the Constitution, because in our system, the Supreme Court has the last word absent a constitutional amendment on the meaning of the Constitution. But the civil rights statute that you referred to earlier, one of the ones I worked on, overruled 7 Supreme Court decisions. It was signed by President George H.W. Bush. Took a couple of years and some pretty intense debates and discussions. But the senator saw Congress as being in the middle of the dialogue about the meaning of constitutional rights, whether and statutory civil rights, whether that was through legislating or through nominating and confirming members of the courts.
Yeah. And Judge Saris, you too worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee with the senator. What are your thoughts?
Well, yes, and in particular, when the Congress is upset with the way the courts are handling certain things, they jump into action. And I think particularly of the Congress is very concerned that courts weren't taking patents seriously enough. And that was one of the reasons why there was major patent reform legislation. And similarly, I think there was an over deference at various points to legislative bodies like in airlines or in trucking, when they were basically freezing into place an anti-competitive system, and Congress through oversight, which is we never heard a lot about, but at the time people didn't as much, but oversight hearings very much exposed some of those issues in the industry. I also remember back in the day, there was freedom of press issues having to do with the Stanford Daily case, which was an older case, and Congress, including the Senate, are quite upset about the extent to which the Justice Department may subpoena press records that dealt with confidential informants to the press. And they jumped in and expressed their dissatisfaction. So there was a dialogue, and it sometimes came in through the confirmation hearings and the questions that were asked, and sometimes it was through legislative oversight or legislative action, passing bills.
So I want to talk a bit about working across branches, but also working across party lines. Secretary Spellings, talk a little bit about the approach that Senator Kennedy took in working with you and the Bush administration on No Child Left Behind.
Well, I would say that both he and President Bush really understood that if you were going to do anything of consequence that affected every community, that having some kind of, comity and bipartisan support across the aisle is a way not only to get people on board, but to make legislation stick over time. And we've seen the erosion of that and what it's meant. And I'll use Obamacare as an example where when you don't have that, you have years of litigation and so on. So the best way to do things is to get a lot of people on board, big policy, do it in regular order, and do it virtually unanimously if you can. And so that's obviously all about relationships and finding common cause. And Senator Kennedy was really good about that. And the U.S. Department of Education, our primary role as an agency since its creation in the aftermath or during the Johnson administration was all around civil rights and the power and the muscle of that entity to see about Title I, special education, Title IX, et cetera. So it was very, very central to that. And George W. Bush was unique and he was not abolish the Department of Ed kind of Republican. And so we were able to find common cause. And frankly, I'm very proud to say that the key aspects of No Child Left Behind, live on to this day. They've been reauthorized, they've been renamed, but this focus on the achievement gap, holding ourselves accountable, measurement, transparency, all those sorts of things that frankly is the Ted Kennedy playbook across many other areas of public policy as well. So I can give you many examples. I mean, he was an aggregator of staff and teams. We would have pizza night in the, his special Senate room and just keep people working, keep people talking. That was a big, kind of strategy. You don't let people go into their corners for too very long. You keep people together, buy them free pizza, whatever it takes, but keep the dialogue open.
Yeah. Jumping in for a second, it was so different back then. My daughter subsequently worked for the senator, actually, many years later. But it was so different when I did it. When I was there, you would have lunch with the staff members in the Senate cafeteria on both sides of the aisle and break bread. And he would have Christmas parties with people on both sides would come in. And am I remembering this or am I crazy that people all used to sing together, Orrin Hatch, everyone about.
Absolutely.
It was. And
Trent
so
Lott.
That's right. It became personal friendship that overcame these sort of policy disagreements, for want of a better word.
Yeah, true enough.
And as you probably both remember, he wore some pretty amazing costumes at those Christmas parties. I can recall Batman. I can recall Vicky being the beauty and him being the beast. And I can recall some others that probably should await airtime. I wanted to add something, if I may, to what Secretary Spellings said. Why was he able to make the compromises with the Republicans the way he was? I think people don't appreciate a couple of things. Primarily because he was the liberal lion and would fight quite hard for what he believed in. Republican senators with whom I often spoke knew that if he made a deal, it would stick. And I think one of the things you see today is there's no one who can do that. I can recall when we finally reached agreement with President Bush 41 on the Civil Rights Bill. Senator Kennedy went over to the House at about 6 a.m. the next morning and met with some of the more progressive members of the House and said, look, this is the best I could do. And that quieted concerns. If you look at what happened, for example, last summer when it was very difficult in the Senate, and to Secretary Spellings' point, it was partisan. You couldn't make a deal with Senator Manchin on the one hand that the progressives in the House would accept. Senator Kennedy was in the unique role to be able to make agreements like that all sides could accept.
Yeah, and sorry.
No, I was just going to jump in and say, I think one of his greatest disappointments was also a show of great bipartisanship when he and President Bush were able to work out a compromise on immigration that may well have now solved some of the problems that we're looking at on the border, et cetera. I mean, the two of them worked so hard together and well together, and they came up with a compromise. And maybe someone remembers, but it only failed by a few votes. And it was I think one of his great disappointments that he couldn't pass the torch to the next generation with that solution in place, but it didn't happen, although it was a great bipartisan team effort.
Absolutely. And McCain and Menendez.
Right.
I mean, we got so close, and gosh, what a world of difference it might have made. And I think that's obviously one of President Bush's biggest regrets as well, because we were so very close.
And I want to drill down on this idea a little bit more, just to sort of distinguish for our audience. How much of this was it a factor of it being a different time where it was easier to work across the aisle, easier to find those compromises than it is today? And how much of it was something that Senator Kennedy brought that was above and beyond that? I mean, Jeff, one area that seems so different than just a short while ago are confirmation hearings, judicial confirmation hearings, especially when it comes to the SCOTUS. And, someone like Anthony Kennedy was able to get easy confirmation, but it's not like the senator didn't have situations where there was opposition. There was obviously the nomination of Bork as well. Jeff, talk a little bit about how the senator worked in both of those situations.
So, as I mentioned earlier, Kimberly, he had a deeply thought out, deeply held view about the meaning of the Constitution, and was not prepared to accept and support a nominee who he felt fundamentally at odds with that. The Bork fight was quite a fight, although I think people don't remember that a half a dozen Republican senators voted against Robert Bork, including John Warner of Virginia. There were plenty of concerns among Republicans as well. But the Bork seat, it was never Bork's seat, but he was nominated to the Powell seat, eventually went to Anthony Kennedy. Anthony Kennedy was confirmed 97-0, just a few months after Bork was rejected. And people don't realize this. Senator Kennedy ended up floor managing the Anthony Kennedy nomination because the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at that time, a fellow named Joseph Biden Jr., was out. He had a brain aneurysm and was quite ill. And so Senator Kennedy took on those duties on Senator Biden's behalf, but he was comfortable after serious scrutiny with then Judge Kennedy's views and was pleased to support him and to floor manage his nomination.
Can I? No,
Judge
go
Saris. You go
No, I was
ahead.
just going to jump in with a memory. After he lost the presidential bid and after the Senate flipped, I stayed on the staff for a while afterwards. And I remember one day he was no longer the chair, obviously, of the Judiciary Committee, but he said, "Come on, Pat, I want you to meet someone." And so I ended up sitting in with him on the Sandra Day O'Connor confirmation hearings as the first woman, and it was clear he wanted me to share that experience, and in that sense was both a someone who was willing to look beyond party lines for someone who's truly exceptional, but also be willing to mentor me, like this, the implicit message being, this could be you. And I remember that. And I also remembered throughout is that while I think the Supreme Court nominations are frequently contentious for sure, the lower court nominations were nowhere near as contentious as they are now. There was the occasional lightning rod, but for the most part, the district and appellate courts went extremely smoothly, both under his mentorship and chairmanship, but also just in general, it just wasn't as contentious as it seems to be now.
Kimberly, I want to weigh in on a couple of things. One is I love Patti's story because it also shows, you got to lose and move on, you got to recover. And he did that over and over again. And we all watched him doing. Secondly, he loved doing it. He loved being the guy who could do the deal. And so he lived for that. And then I just think you ask about kind of the environment, how it has changed. Two things. One is whether we lay it at the feet of redistricting or social media or particular individuals. I mean, we had a heck of a lot more centrist people from both sides of the aisle who, didn't think compromise was a dirty word, number one thing. And number two, just things that were our shared, and these obviously flow together, kind of values and things that were already settled and were untouchable. And I'm talking about things like the Voting Rights Act. George Bush signed it about 4 times, reauthorized it, and Title IX, and all these sorts of things that now are suddenly, open for discussion. That just wasn't the sensibility. There were things that were seen to be settled in the past, and we would build on them.
But Secretary Spellings, that's true. But there were still things that were not without controversy, including No Child Left Behind. So
Sure.
Talk a little bit about that process, how you and Senator Kennedy and others navigated that to get that over the finish line.
Well, I think, and I remember he and President Bush, and I was obviously party to this conversation, really understood their own bottom lines, what it was going to take for Ted Kennedy to go to his colleagues and say, this is a deal worth doing. Likewise, President Bush. And President Bush was bringing Republicans where they did not want to go either. These are the abolished the Department of Ed types and so on. And Senator Kennedy needed some commitments around the civil rights aspects, resources, money was a huge issue for him, clearly. And so understanding those bottom lines and where the territory of the deal was pretty early on, and the things that were off the table. And, when people are still writing about how come George Bush took the issues of school voucher off, so early in the negotiations, or how come Ted Kennedy didn't do this or that. But, they understood what the makings of a deal were even going in.
And a lot of that had to do with personal relationships, right,
Absolutely.
Secretary? I mean, one of my favorite parts of your oral history was you talking about the iPod. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, when he became ill, I sent him an iPod. This was back in the early days of that technology, with a playlist of a bunch of songs that he would get a kick out of, and some that were serious and sweet and whatnot, like, You've Got a Friend, or God Bless Texas, or, these sort of things. And he wrote me a thank you note that used all the song titles in the thank you note, which was hilarious. I also once had the chance to travel with him to Boston. And of course, getting from the gate at Logan Airport, out the door with Ted Kennedy is about a 45-minute exercise, as he greets literally everyone and knows everyone in the airport.
That's absolutely true. And I will just say, relatedly to that, I was a fairly young reporter working at the Boston Herald, and there were times at events that I would try to, go and get a question in to, he's a senior US Senator, probably one of the most senior and well-known people in the Senate at that time. And never once was I, even when he had staff that were trying to keep the press at bay, never once did he not stop and make sure that he answered a question, which is something that is really unheard of for the press in Washington at that time. And I think he also understood the importance of the press. That was part of it, but it was also just the personal respect that he had for people trying to do their jobs. And I want to turn back to Judge Saris and talk about another issue that was important to him that you worked on, which is sentencing reform. Another thing that is not easy to do. Give us an idea about how he operated and how he approached the very thorny subject of sentencing reform.
It's a great issue because it wasn't one that you might suspect that he would take on. So in the mid-70s, before I was there, he got interested in overhauling the entire criminal justice system. It was known as S1. And he hired a former prosecutor, someone well-known now because of his work in the 9/11 Commission and otherwise, Ken Feinberg, to basically spearhead that. And it ran into a lot of headwinds, quite frankly. I mean, it was the liberals hated it because there were certain provisions that were being added in like a Christmas tree almost. And the conservatives hated it because it was, as far as they were concerned, they didn't like some provisions and it was dying of its own weight. But one thing that everyone agreed on was that sentencing needed to be fixed. And so they basically, once again, the pragmatic Senator Kennedy took away the big giant S1 and focused a lot on sentencing reform. They hired several experts. Stephen Breyer became engaged in it, a former federal judge named Marvin Frankel. And the one issue that they decided on was that there shouldn't be unwarranted disparity. Why should a bank robber in Texas get a different kind of sentence than a bank robber in Boston? That kind of question. And so they decided to delegate it to an expert body for sentencing guidelines. And essentially they averaged out judges' sentences across the country and came up with a range. And the whole thing made a ton of sense. Of course, they were just 100 to 0 is somewhat indicative of the fact that we're voting on a broad principle rather than all these little provisions. And the commission came into being in around 1986 and guidelines were implemented. But it rapidly became controversial, not because so much of the guidelines, but because it was at the time when violent crime and drug crime and all that sort of thing were skyrocketing. So the Congress started passing under both Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, Clinton as well as I think it was Reagan, very tough mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And so when the guidelines together with the mandatory minimums started jacking up the prison population to heights that I think no one, including the senator, ever expected. And it was at that point that people started thinking like, all right, how are we going to fix this? Which eventually led to the First Step Act. I frequently thought about the senator. He had died when this whole matter came to people's attention. I kept thinking, how would Senator Kennedy feel about it? And in my heart, I knew that he would want to do something about it so that the guidelines hooked to the mandatory minimums started to bring down sentences. In fact, one of the leaders in this movement was Texas, started one of the first sentencing reform bills in the country because it was just getting too expensive for the states, actually. Right. And so we started doing that, and it eventually led to the First Step Act, which passed in the last few years. But that's a big trajectory. The truth is the senator was willing to roll up his sleeves and come up with the compromise that everyone could agree on and shed the rest of it because he had that level of pragmatism. I didn't know if Jeff jumped in because I'd moved home to Boston to have my family, and Jeff at that point was there during the mandatory minimum fit craze.
Which Senator Kennedy opposed, as you know, Patty. I think a couple of observations to support what you were saying. One is he took the long view. He took the long view on legislating. Two of the bills that I worked on that you mentioned, Kimberly, filled gaps in some of the major civil rights laws from the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not give women, for example, who were harassed on the job, an effective remedy. And so we went back in 1991, 27 years later, and filled that gap. The Fair Housing Act was passed in a rush in 1968 after Martin Luther King was assassinated. Congress acted very quickly, but there was a threat of Republican, forgive me, it's really a Southern filibuster, and it was a fairly weak measure. Well, in 1988, with the support eventually of the Reagan administration, Senator Kennedy came in and filled the gap, made stronger remedies for housing discrimination. So you take the long view. The other sort of superpower he had, if I may say, one of the things that I think people don't fully appreciate, he had a remarkable sense of timing. He would read a room, he would read a group of people, and he would have the sense of when the arguing had to end and the agreement needed to be reached. And I remember him talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which I played only a very, very small role in. And he said to me, you know, we got that off the Senate floor in 2 days. Had it stayed on the Senate floor one more day, it might have fallen apart. But he just had this amazing, and maybe it was from being the ninth kid, frankly, and watching all of his siblings go at it with each other. He just had this amazing intuition about people and when they were ready to agree and when he had to strike that last compromise.
I really agree with that too, Jeff. And Kimberly added another thing that to build on what Patti said earlier as well, and that is that he also knew what the Congress had to do and what could be delegated or punted sometimes to regulatory agencies or other bodies or commissions or what, you know, live to fight another day on and refine over time. So, and you know, there's a lot of that happened too, but he was good. You know, he obviously was there for a long time and could come back.
And some of it, and I'm sure you both heard him say this, he would say, you got to work it, you got to work it. And what he meant in that context was go to the secretary who's writing the regulations and make sure she's heard his thoughts on how the statute should be interpreted. You know, file a brief in court about how to interpret something that he worked on. He was pretty relentless at sharing his views, not only with his colleagues in Congress, but with the other two branches as well.
Well, I just want to say, first, I want to remind our audience, if you have a question, we're going to go to them in just a few minutes, and there's still time for you to ask your question using the Q&A function, and we will get to as many as we can. But before we get to the audience questions, I want to ask, is this something that can be replicated? Can we get to a point again, using the same approaches that you've been explaining that Senator Kennedy took in order to get this kind of bipartisan, you know, respectful compromise in many areas? You know, he did this with the filibuster. You know, the tools that aren't even as strong now as they were then. What can Washington of today and of the future learn? And do you have any faith that we can return to that sort of experience that you all had? I'll start with senators, with Secretary Spellings.
You always start with me on the hard ones, Kimberly. Anyway, as I like to say, we're never going to have better government than the people in it. And I think this corrosive, what people are watching, you know, sensible, sane people think, well, why would I want to be party to something like that? And so I think, you know, individual leaders, people who are, you know, courageous doers, et cetera, that matters a lot. And so the more I think we get a flywheel going when we have the kind of legislator and leader that Senator Kennedy was. But, you know, we also have to go talk up government. I mean, all of us have had amazing experience in public life, and Patti still is. So, I think it's incumbent on those of us who have had really rich and rewarding experiences to go tap kind people on the shoulder and enlist them.
100% on that. And I would say, if you read Master of the Senate, for example, Robert Cairo's amazing book about Lyndon Johnson, he goes back into the history in the 19th century. And the world's greatest deliberative body has had other periods where it was not the world's greatest deliberative body. There's a bit of a pendulum that swings back and forth. And I think, as Margaret put it perfectly, it's really a matter of what the American people decide in terms of what kind of legislators they want to elect.
Yeah, I agree with Margaret and Jeff. And I think people miss or don't totally understand what a wonderful person the senator was. I mean, he was the first person there when my father was dying, and you can hear that story replicated across so many people. He treated people like people, rather than just in a political way. And that's, if you're going to have a good deliberative body, you have to be able to trust. Just trust. I think Margaret used that term initially, just trust. And I don't know how we can build back that level of trust that you can disagree without being horrible to one another.
And that there's real value in problem solving. I mean, frankly, at the moment, we have very little consequences on either side for doing nothing. And, we have really a lot of issues that could use some of this. And I don't want to say that because I think there have been some real gains made in the last couple of years on important things that have been bipartisan, like infrastructure and COVID response and on and on. But, there's also very little penalty for, going up there and shutting the government down or being an obstructionist.
All right, I'm going to start asking some of the questions that we've received. There have been a lot. I want to start with one I think is interesting. Senator Kennedy was on the Judiciary Committee for pretty much his entire career. What about that particular committee do you think he found compelling? Jeff, do you want to take a stab at that?
I alluded to his deep interest in the Constitution and in justice. I feel like, and I heard him say many times, and I suspect that Patti and Margaret did, that civil rights was the unfinished business of the country. I think it was also the unfinished business of his brothers, and he felt their presence very, very strongly. And so I think that was one aspect of it. But his work on behalf of refugees, he wrote the law, and I think this, Patti, was during your tenure. The Refugee Act of 1980 is the sort of fundamental law that protects those who were forcibly displaced wherever around the world because of who they are. He would tell stories of his grandfather talking about no Irish need apply in his native Boston. The Judiciary Committee is where all that work got done. So, I think it's a combination of those elements.
I would agree with that, but I also add that his true love was where Margaret was. When he was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and then, as I mentioned, the Senate flipped during 1980, and he was given a chance to move from ranking member and judiciary to labor and education and human resources, and he made that move. I remember being disappointed at the time, but of course he knew where his heart was. His heart was in those health issues and those education issues and the labor issues. I think from judiciary, it's exactly what Jeff said. He had a commitment to civil rights and the Constitution, but his passion was in these other areas as well. And I will say, on immigration, of those few people who were kept on after the Senate had to be diminished, the key guy, Jerry Tinker, I think, who's now passed on, I think, but in any case, he did the immigration. That was one of the people left at the end of it because of his caring about immigration and refugee.
Yeah, and Judge Saris anticipated my next question, which I was going to ask Secretary Spellings. Most of my interface with him in his office was involved the Help Committee on those issues of health and education and labor. Secretary Spellings, talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, you're right. And of course, that was a huge asset to a lot of things. And I'll just say this, I want to say this in a delicate and nice way. You know, he could run the tables with that area of policy because of his strength. And because frankly, if you're a leading Republican, you know, the Help Committee is the last place you want to be. You want to be in business and commerce and, you know, things like that. It's, you know, typically not their top priority. So, you know, he was the giant of the committee. He could pretty much do, you know, have outsized influence there and did for many years. And, you know, we would not have gotten a lot of things done without Senator Kennedy, period.
Just to add one thing to what Patti said, when he left being ranking member of Judiciary for the Help Committee, as it's come to be known, he had an understanding with Joe Biden, then ranking member Biden, President Biden, that on civil rights legislation in the Judiciary Committee, he would continue to take the lead and did so. And so he was able to have in some ways the best of both worlds on that.
So another question that we have for Secretary Spellings and whomever else wants to weigh in says, for a senator so familiar with the White House, was this intimidating for other presidents and their staff?
Good question.
If I understand the question, was it intimidating for people in the White House to deal with him or vice versa?
Yes, because of his familiarity with the White House.
You know, maybe a little bit. I mean, he was, you know, a legendary guy, especially, you know, I had the pleasure of working with him in the later part of his service, of course. And but also, you know, to Jeff's point, I mean, he was the go-to guy. So if you got him, he could make a deal stick. And so I'll never forget, I'm probably said this in my, you know, audible history or whatever. One of the first it was literally the first week of President Bush's presidency. And he invited Senator Kennedy, Vicky, George Miller, his wife, Judd Gray, you know, kind of family night at the White House movie theater. And the movie 13 Days, which of course is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, was showing on this very intimate venue. And one of my, still gives me chills kind of memories, is seeing President Bush and Senator Kennedy sitting on the front row of the movie theater, watching the movie 13 Days that is all basically takes place in the White House with, you know, obviously Senator Kennedy's brother as the featured player. Anyway, just the 1 degree of separation on all of this, and the importance of kind of the moment that we're in, the importance of timing and seizing the day.
Can I offer just a memory, speaking of his familiarity with the White House, when we reached agreement with the Reagan administration and the Senate passed the Fair Housing Bill I mentioned, we were invited to the Rose Garden for the signing ceremony. Well, so I was privileged to go with him. And the day, this were a little different times in terms of security and everything. He said, come on, I'll give you a tour. This is at the end of the Reagan administration. And he just started walking me through the cabinet room and the Roosevelt room with nobody with him. It was like, you know, his brother, it had been his brother's house. But that's how familiar he was with the building.
So another question we have is, when did nominating and confirming Supreme Court justices become so partisan? Are there other times during our country's history when this was the case, and what pulled us out of it? Jeff, you want to take the first stab at that?
Yes, and I've been involved and have written about that a little bit. You know, our history is pretty complicated. George Washington's nomination of Rutledge was turned down because Rutledge opposed the Jay Treaty, or I may be getting it confused. but because of opposition to the Jay Treaty. There have been times in our history when ideology, when philosophy has come into account, number one. Number two, the country is divided, unfortunately. There's a polarization in our parties. We used to have Northern Republicans, moderate Republicans, and conservative Southern Democrats. So that has contributed to the polarization of the court. The court has become more important in our lives. You know, before the New Deal, the court really didn't do much that affected the lives of Americans in a good way. I mean, you know, we had Dred Scott, we had some terrible things that happened, but the Warren Court in particular made the Supreme Court much more important in our country. And that has certainly fed the polarization around the Supreme Court. It's far too hard to amend the Constitution. Justice Scalia actually used to talk about that. So if you want to amend the Constitution, affect the selection of a Supreme Court justice. That's really the only way to amend the Constitution in a deeply divided country. So a lot of that polarization, I think, unfortunately, is structural. And until we get over the polarization, it's going to be hard to fix.
Right. Another question is, were there other examples of times when Senator Kennedy came to impasses with presidents or their administrations and had to wait out a new administration?
I don't know about that, but I will tell a story about, we were at a major impasse on No Child Left Behind, which was the president's, Bush's top priority when he came to office. And, we worked all that year in 2001, and then 9/11 happened. And I mean, the wheels were really off as we headed into the August recess, and then 9/11. And you'll recall, hard to believe, that photo of every member of Congress on the front steps of the Capitol. And Senator Kennedy's, really kicked off a renewed, by God, we're going to get this done. We're going to work together. We're going to, show the American people we can do something on their behalf, et cetera. And so the wheels, because of that, tragedy and precipitating event, good things, happened. There was momentum that, okay, enough of the, we got to major in the majors here.
One other example, and of course we all remember how Congress came together after 9/11. But in the case of the Civil Rights Act, in 1990, President Bush vetoed it, and the veto was sustained. The overruling of the veto failed by one vote, so the veto was sustained. The next year he came back, and this really illustrates something important about Senator Kennedy. He stepped back and encouraged Senator Danforth to take the lead in negotiating with the Bush administration. He used to say, you can get a lot more done if you don't care who gets the credit. And so that was a case where he was frustrated in one Congress, took a different tack, and ultimately succeeded, largely because of his willingness to put his own ego aside and let someone else take much of the credit.
And of course, we haven't talked much about his true commitment to healthcare reform, which was something he ultimately didn't succeed in getting himself, but because he kept the flame alive despite enormous frustrations. I can't even imagine what it must have been like, Congress after Congress after Congress not getting it. For him to live long enough to see another president take that on, I think it wouldn't have happened unless he had kept that alive.
All right, another question that we have is about the press. I sort of talked a little bit about the fact that he answered my questions. I don't know if he always did that or if I had to jump because I started my career where I'm at now, which is at the hometown paper for him. But what role do you think the press played in the relationship between Senator Kennedy and the White House? And is that different today?
I don't know.
I guess, I mean, I'm probably going to give you an upside down answer to that.
Okay.
In the sense that I think now a lot of people in the president's party and in the other party speak to the president through the press. Senator Kennedy was actually somebody who would pick up the phone, who preferred, he thought the press was very important in informing the public and informing public opinion, but he communicated largely directly. He believed strongly in that. I will say one thing I remember after I left during the Iraq War, people were talking about the polling around the Iraq War, and Senator Kennedy said something along the lines of, but it's informed public opinion that matters. It's informed public opinion. And so he thought it was very important for the press to inform the American public about issues so that polls reflected the real information.
So I'm going to ask one more question before I throw it back to Bob, because we're almost out of time. Do you think, without playing guessing games, that there are any potential senators in the body now that could be like Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion, and someone who knew how to work the deal? And if you don't want to name specific people, you can speak more generally about whether that's possible again. Jeff?
Can I take that on, and actually Bob could comment about this if he jumps on at the end. I was in Faneuil Hall the night Senator Kennedy debated Mitt Romney in 1994. Yep. And Bob was deeply, deeply involved in helping him prepare for that debate. And Mitt Romney, and this probably will do him absolutely no good politically, among the Republican senators, has shown great character, great courage. And I don't agree with him 99% of the time, but kind of looking across the aisle, there's somebody, standard bearer for his party, who has potential, maybe not to be a Ted Kennedy. I think that would be a bit too far to go. But there are some people who have the potential to be great senators in both parties.
Anyone else?
I think that's a great question, Bob.
Well, why don't we bring,
Jeff, yeah.
well, why don't we bring Bob back in, and thank you to our panelists for a great discussion.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Yeah, this was a fabulous discussion. I love seeing all of you. I love the memories, but I think the memories are instructive about the future. So I really want to thank all of you. I do believe that we're going to need a change in the weather, the political weather, for someone to function as effectively as Ted Kennedy did in the Senate. And I want to thank everyone who's watching today. Stay tuned, and you'll get a notice about the next episode in our Enduring Legacy series. Thank all of you. Thank our audience, and see you later.